So that's really insightful about, newcomer and immigrant students. Would you mind telling me a little bit about maybe that same cost of resilience? What does that look like for the parents of newcomer and immigrant families?
So I think one of the big things that happen is that we have to be strong, same way that our students have had to be strong when navigating these systems. And part of that is just kind of dealing with it all yourself, right? And when you deal with it all yourself, you're not reaching out for help. So one of the biggest costs that I've seen is that particularly Black parents, but also more generally newcomer families, don't reach out to the services that are available to them because there's this understanding that I can do it myself. And only when it gets too bad will I then reach out to a resource, a school resource, a social worker, a psychologist, an advocacy worker. So in a lot of ways, what happens is parents will not reach out to the services because they believe that at the end of the day, they're gonna do it themselves. They know their children best. No one else can help them, and that's the end of the story. So what ends up happening in those cases are families tend to get really worn down by the system, and I think in a lot of ways, systems are actually meant to do that to these families so that they don't speak up about these large issues that are happening in our school system in particular. So what I've seen a lot of times is administrators emailing back and forth nonstop with these families without an understanding that these families have lives, they have other things to do. And the point of that sometimes is to get the parents to a place where they just let go. They don't continue to advocate for their child.
Yeah, it's extremely well said. So I really don't want to miss an opportunity to sort of ask you for advice that you would provide to newcomer and immigrant parents and students and families. So if there are three big pieces of advice, three things that you're like, you know what, if you don't remember anything else, remember these three things. What are those three pieces of advice to support newcomer and immigrant families to successfully navigate this school system, to support their kids to exact their full potential, to take it to the absolute peak of what they can achieve? What are those three pieces of advice you'd give?
So kind of bouncing off our last question, I think one thing that parents can do is reach out to those services. We have so many services here in Ottawa that help you understand the education system, that provide translation services, that allow you to advocate and to be there for your child when things might go south, right? So one of my big pieces of advice is don't be afraid to ask for help, Although, we are strong people, we have gone through a lot to make us these strong people. At the end of the day, sometimes you do need help, especially when you're challenging these big institutions, right? So that's my first piece of advice. My second piece of advice would be get to know your child. I think a lot of times, schools in particular, teachers in particular, they tell you how your child is. They tell you that your child has behavioral issues. They tell you that your child is not achieving. They tell you that your child should be at a lower level than they actually think they need to be at. And if you know your child well, you have all the information needed to advocate for them when teachers come to you and say, I know your child better than you do. So my big thing would be to get to know your child, get to know what works for them, what doesn't work for them. So for example, a lot of families during this COVID pandemic have struggled with trying to separate, screen time and leisure time. Some of that doesn't work for children. Some children need a little bit of screen time, a little bit of time to go out and play basketball and come back in for that screen time, right? So get to know what works for your child so that you can advocate for them when teachers or administrators tell you that they're not performing how they should be performing. If you know your child, you'll say, well, he's not performing because of XYZ, right? Because he's not getting, time to breathe, time to go outside for a walk, time to take care of himself. Some students work really, really well with, a structure. So if you can provide that structure for your child at home, then that would help teachers understand that you're actually doing something for them, that you're not a disengaged parent, which a lot of times that is actually what teachers want you to believe, is that you're disengaged and that you're not fully there for your child. But when you get to know them and you have proof of what works for them and what doesn't work for them, then you're set to advocate for them. So that would be my second piece of advice. So my third piece of advice would just to try your best to make your child not feel isolated. Again, in the middle of a pandemic, it's very easy for your child to miss their friends, to miss school, to miss structure. So if you can, try and create a space for them where they don't feel alone. Hopefully, like organizing some sort of social activity for them with their friends, like going to the park, playing basketball, anything like that to help them realize that, they aren't alone. Back to the question about stress, like if you feel isolated, it will exacerbate your stress. So if you organize spaces for your child to get that social activity that they need, then hopefully it'll make them feel a little less isolated, let alone when you're trying to fight the system or your child is trying to navigate the school system.